Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. Now, we are seeing India sign trade deals back to back, and the most recent announcement has been that of an interim agreement with the United States. Now, this announcement has been a lot of mixed bag if we look at the reactions, mainly because it involves announcements in sensitive sectors to India, agriculture being the most contentious one. So, this episode attempts to answer if the interim agreement is favorable for India and what it could look like going ahead. To discuss the finer print from the agreement and the long negotiations between India and the US, I am joined by Anisree Suresh, research analyst with the geoeconomics team at the Takshashila Institution. Welcome to the episode, Anisree.
Thank you, Bhumika.
So, Anisree, you have been following these FTA negotiations, and right up front from the interim agreement, what are your three key takeaways from this announcement? And most importantly, where do we stand on the tariff meter? And how far have we been able to move Trump from his starting line?
Yeah. Thanks, Bhumika, once again. This is a very interesting question, and we are having this discussion at a very interesting time in history, too. So, since the deal was announced through a joint statement on February 7th, the contours of what this deal is about, there's a lot of confusion regarding this. There's a lot of ambiguity about it and everything. And the statement itself did not mention the additional 25% penal tariff the US had levied on India for its import of Russian oil and everything. However, US President Donald Trump took to social media saying that Prime Minister Narendra Modi had agreed to stop importing Russian oil. And further, on February 6th or something, Mr. Trump again issued an executive order removing this additional 25% penal tariff, saying that India has committed to stop directly or indirectly importing Russian Federation oil. So, in return, the joint statement says that India will eliminate or reduce tariffs on all US industrial goods and a wide range of US food and agriculture products, including distillers, grains, red sorghum, tree nuts, some of the fruits, soybean oil, and all those things, right? And the third part of the deal is that India intends to buy more American products and purchase over $500 billion of US energy and some other products as well. Now, let's come to the good part of the deal, right? Now this tariff at 18% means that India is slightly better than its competitors, such as Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, Pakistan, and the Philippines. With all of these countries, they're not far below. They're at, their tariffs is also at 19-20%. There's a slight, very slight advantage India might have with that tariff advantage.
Right.
However, if you look at it, more than the advantage that we get from its competitors right now, we have to look at it where we were in the past couple of months, right? In the sense, in the past months, US had imposed a 50% punitive tariffs against India. And that means, as per the global tariff tracker, India had a 19.5% relative tariff disadvantage compared to its peers. Indicating that it was relatively highly taxed than any of its competitors, any of its peers, any of its export competitors in the US market. And if you look at India's exports to the US, being one of our largest partners of trade, 60% of India's total exports to the US were subject to 50% of tariff. And we had sectors like textiles, gems and jewelry and marine products that were highly impacted by this 50% tariff. And most of these sectors relies on the US for over 30% of our exports. So that means we had a bit of, we were dominating some of these sectors in the US market, and we were relying on the US market for many of our exports, and that was highly affected under the 50% tariff rate. So considering all that now with the 18% tariff, it definitely offers a short-term relief for Indian exporters who would have otherwise eventually had to face the existential threat in the US
Hmm.
market, right? And this kind of allows India to continue exporting to the US, continue negotiating with the US without being forced to exit from the US market, or take some immediate radical diversification with a very huge transition cost. So in that way, that's the real good part of the deal. More than about what the contours of the deal is, it's mostly about it allows us a space.
Hmm.
It allows us to rethink our trade strategies. It allows us to see whether we need to diversify or not. So I think that's the important and the good part of this deal that I want to highlight.
Right. Thanks, Anishree, for taking us through those details and for the highlight that you've given. So we do know that trade deals are beneficial for the Indian economy given the market access that it provides, right? And you also
Yes.
mentioned that the goods that were highly taxed can now again
Yeah.
enter the US market. So, but there are always certain exemptions to be made in return, right? So we largely believe that this deal can turn out to be favorable for India, and yet, there has been so much noise around India softening its stance around food and agricultural products, the non tariff barriers like the genetically modified food products. So, could you take us through some of those details so as to understand what are some aspects that can turn out to be favorable and what can be the impact of this deal on certain sectors?
Yeah, so the agriculture and dairy sector, let's go there itself. It's a very interesting example, and it's also the trickiest part of this deal, right?
Yeah.
So, unlike most of the free trade deals, we don't know much about what's going to happen to agriculture, whether cereals are included, pulses are included. There's a lot of confusion about it. So, I'm not going there. But if you generally look at agriculture as a sector, it has always been politically highly sensitive for both countries, for almost every country in the world.
Mhm.
So while you have US who wants better market access for its farm exports, and you have on the other hand, you have India who remains unwilling to open up a sector it has protected fiercely for decades. And that was the story we had until now, right? So again, going back to US, on one hand, within agriculture, there's a possibility that India might have agreed to import some of the US soybean and some of the other things, some of the fruits, some of the nuts and all those. Given that the US agriculture sector, I mean, Trump is also facing a lot of pressure in terms of, for example, if you look at the soybean itself, that's one of the highest exports of the US, and it's highly under acute strain due to reduced demand from China
Hmm.
in the last couple of months, and thus leading to farm bankruptcies in US that are 36% higher in 2025 than 2024. So
Oh.
there's a lot of political domestic pressure on the current Trump administration from the farm community in the US, right?
Right.
But on the other hand, if you look at India also, our agriculture and dairy sector is highly sensitive to us, highly politically sensitive in the sense that, most of our agricultural trade policies have been shaped by non-tariff barriers and higher tariffs to protect that community, right? But at the same time, India enjoyed a wealthy, healthy, 3.4 billion dollars surplus in agricultural trade with the US in the last couple of years.
Hmm.
And American buyers are the second largest consumers of many of India's farm exports, including basmati rice and all those things. And but at the same time, being that we have a good agricultural trade relations with the US, India also used to impose some of the highest agricultural tariffs in the world, averaging 39%. For instance, if you look the skimmed milk powder or many of the products in the dairy sector, it had a whopping 60% tariff against any of the US
Hmm.
exports into India. And fresh cheese and curd had around 30%. So it's one of the highest in the world, right? And if you look at it, not just higher import duties, but India's agricultural trade policy is also pretty much shaped by the non-tariff barriers as such. And they have many forms, right? Some offer extra export bans, such as we had on certain animal fats and oils. Some involve licensing requirements specifically for the livestock products, dairy products and everything.
Hmm.
And we had very specific livestock requirement in the sense if India prohibits dairy imports from animals which are fed with organs or blood meal. So we need vegetarian livestock
Animal products. Yeah.
and milk products from the vegetarian. So that's some of the requirements that we had of with respect to our agricultural imports from other countries. And if you look at it over the time, the government has added multiple other hurdles for foreign dairy producers, introducing new health certification requirements and mandatory facility registration and all those things. And now, we also have restrictions on genetically modified crops like soy and corn. And while I'm not getting into that conversation, I think we had a previous episode on agricultural trade and our policies on that.
Right.
So you have to see that, like, even our restriction on genetically modified crops, it's not really scientific based. It has a lot of other cultural sensitivities and, our own fears with a lot of things. So I'm not getting into that part of the conversation. But it's not really like beneficial to India also, because like oftentimes what happens is, like, because we protect our agriculture sector too fiercely, what happens is at times we lose out on opportunities. For example, if you look at some of the domestic policies like minimum support prices and export bans, that impact our own farmers more than anybody else. So it has a lot of, it's very restrictive in nature. It distorts the market. So there are a lot of other issues with that too. So in a way, so opening up our agriculture to a certain extent is good. However, this is where it gets really tricky, because, at the same time, when we say that, okay, India has to open up its agriculture and sector, and on the other hand, US protects its agriculture sector too. It's not that they are fairly
Exactly.
open about their sector. There's a lot of subsidies goes into those sectors, and so that's distorting the market too. And most of the times we have very small farmers, but they have like a large farm owners and everything. So there's a huge clash between, when you're giving subsidy to large farmers, and how do we expect a fair competition in terms of, like, agriculture products and everything. So that's where it gets really tricky. But at the same time, the problem is, like, it's very difficult to open up agriculture sector, very difficult to address all these issues, because of the fact that oftentimes farmers, politicians, elections, they are very tightly knit together. It's very hard to separate one another and look at it objectively. So that's where it's problem. But again, going back to one of the points that I want to highlight here is, like, maybe let's not look at, what in terms of agriculture, what in terms of textiles that we would be gaining from this agreement, or like what we would be losing out. I think we should genuinely see this interim deal as a small fragile window of opportunity to enhance India's competitiveness in the export markets and diversify its exports to, and look at what are the other market or access options that India have. So whether or not India has a comprehensive trade deal with the US doesn't really matter. So it doesn't change. I think the one good strategy that we have to continue is, ensure that we're getting market access, ensure India's competitiveness is globally good, and it's, able to compete in global markets and all those things. And what we have to show this, we also have to diversify to various other markets, have more FTAs with various countries. So more often, it's like this interim trade deal and take 80% tariff is more of a political signal that negotiations are happening. We're opening our pathways for further negotiation. We're seeing where it takes us. So let's look at it from that perspective more than, what would be the impact to India. But there will be a lot of conversation, and we should look into that too. But I think, like, at this moment, it's more of a political signal, and see, where we can open up and where we can negotiate, where we should close our doors. Yes.
Right. So, Anisree, those were a couple of really interesting points on how the farmers constitute a politically sensitive issue in both India and the US,
Yeah.
as well as the issues that you highlighted with India's policies and how that has affected productivity of our farmlands here. Again, some of the things that you mentioned on what India should do going ahead, I think, are also some of the very interesting key takeaways that we can highlight from this podcast. But I just wanted to touch upon the point that you made in your previous answer about where India stands from its competitors in Southeast Asia and our neighborhood itself. So I was just looking at some of the deals that the US has struck with some of Southeast Asian countries, mainly Indonesia, Vietnam, and as well as I'd also looked at the deal that they have with Bangladesh. So more or less, as you said, right, the revised tariffs have come around at the same level. They have it around 19-20%, while we've gotten it at 18%. So in terms of tariff levels, there's not much of an advantage. But if you look at the give and take that they've had to make in the trade deal, I think that's where India has sort of gotten a better deal. So if you look at Indonesia's deal, they had to eliminate 99% of its tariff barriers on industrial goods and agricultural products. And while the United States, in return, provided no additional concessions. Indonesia also did not receive modifications to the 232 sectoral tariffs that the US has had applied for concerning with the national security measures. So, but Indonesia agreed to exempt US companies and goods from its local content requirements, which is sort of inconsistent with how Jakarta usually uses its protectionist policies. Um, and it also accepted US motor vehicle and emission standards, made similar exemptions for the US agricultural products. So again, if you look at Vietnam as well, so Vietnam also agreed to make regulatory adjustments to accept more of US products, and also facilitate import licenses for the medical devices, reduce barriers to their pharmaceutical products and other things. So that's one thing. And if we come to Bangladesh, so again, 19% is also their revised tariff. But Bangladesh also agreed to provide preferential market access for a range of US industrial and agricultural products. This includes beef, chemicals, dairy, energy products, and soy, as you mentioned, right? So tariff modifications, again, they also did not receive any modifications in the 232 sectoral tariffs. But in return, the tariff exemptions that the US is going to give in certain identified products is yet to be finalized or yet to be announced or clarified, right? So the textile and apparel, I think, is the key sort of market that we compete on with Bangladesh. But again, while we even our textile industry has received some market access to the US, but in terms of Bangladesh, the key difference is the US agreement to establish a mechanism for zero tariffs on specific textiles and apparel goods from the Bangladesh. But there's also a clause that only those products will receive those exemptions if they're using cotton or imports from the US. So that's again another sort of restriction that the Bangladesh had to face. And again, there was,
I mean, just want to add that so there's another point also, like Bangladesh used to export a lot of cotton from India. So now that will be a lot of issues, because now the deal with the US is that US will, I mean, Bangladesh will buy it from, from the US. So it has like a slight impact on India, I guess.
Interesting. So yeah, that's also there. And then just one last highlight that I wanted to make is that Bangladesh and a few other countries as well, the agreements also included this language where they prohibit the import of goods produced by forced labor and maintain high environmental standards. So I think this is a recurring feature in all of these agreements that I mentioned. And as far as I understand, it is mostly aimed at their increasing imports from China. So
So I just want to highlight something also here. So for example, for instance, if you look at it, US had also announced a trade deal with the EU in, like, I think in July 2025. However, US has, like, last month threatened like 8 European allies with an additional tariffs of like 10% from February onwards and 25% from June over the issue of Greenland. So I think one thing is, like, while these deals negotiations are happening, the uncertainty attached to the current Trump administration is something that we cannot ignore. And businesses or any investments or any kind of trade need secured, predictable environment for it to sustain and to thrive and everything. And unfortunately, despite we have this interim trade deal with the US, I think that predictability is not promised, because like what we see with the EU also is, like, while these things they were able to negotiate and get into some kind of interim deal as well, if there are any, like, issues that comes in, like, that's against the US national interest or something, then, like, this is not promising that it could overcome that, the deal could overcome that kind of futuristic challenges. So I think one thing is, like, while it's a good thing that we are able to negotiate again and we're able to get into a tariff level that is comparable to many of our peers and negotiator. At the same time, I don't think we can treat this deal at the moment as same as other FTAs. Again, it's an interim deal, but it's also very limited in scope, and it has high scope or subject to reversal in the future as well if there are some issues that comes in the plate as we go.
Right. So that uncertainty is, I think, always going to remain with the Trump administration. So, but looking at the other deals that India has struck with the EU and the UK over the past, how do you compare the US interim deal with those
Yeah.
ones?
So if you look at the EU deal, I'll take the EU example, not much of UK. So if you look at the EU deal itself, you can see that it's fundamentally different from the deal with the US, right? Okay, first of all, it's an interim deal with the US. More than that, India and EU finally concluded the free trade agreement after nearly 20 years of negotiations. So 20 years we've been in between, we were stuck at some of the issues and everything. But given the turn in the geoeconomic environment that we have today, we have decided that this is the right time to get this deal out, and let's go ahead so that we have some leeway in fighting the uncertainties that the current environment is provided. And it's comprehensive, unlike the deal with the US. And there's a lot of clarity. There's no ambiguity about where India will be, where EU will be, what would be the negotiations, how it's phasing out the tariffs and all those things. There's a lot of clarity about how this deal is going to play out. And it's largely a mutually win-win situation. So we have tariffs aligned in a way that we have a lot of experts, and in EU will remove tariffs on more than 90% of its tariff lines, while India will do the same for 86%, covering over 90% of trade value on both sides. So along with that, both sides will partially liberalize a significant number of additional tariff lines as well, bringing the overall coverage of trade liberalization to around 96% in India and 99% in the EU. So, for example, sectors like fisheries, chemicals, textiles, footwear, pharmaceuticals would gain a lot of significant market access to the India EU deal. So, and in the scenario that we had at that time when we signed the deal was 50% tariffs on Indian exports to the US. So the damage was also concentrated on these sectors. So this was a one good way for us to, look at how we can reroute some of these trade to the EU and all those things. So that's why this deal was really comprehensive, and it was a very win-win situation for both India and EU.
Right.
Yeah. And but I think one thing is while it's a win of negotiations, win of kind of a trade diplomacy in terms of that we got this India EU deal. I think the timing of the deal is the most important factor here. At the time that the world itself is grasping for ways to manage the tariff chaos evoked by the Trump administration in the sense. So it's not like India and you didn't have any issues. That's why the negotiations went on for 20 years, because we had a lot of challenges, especially one with the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And again, agriculture was an area of sensitivity between both India and EU. But what it kind of did is it kind of accelerated the process towards in the last 1 year. And look at let's look at the differences maybe later and see what are the futuristic way to address agriculture issues and CPM. And I think that's one of the great things about the India UT. But unlike this, the US deal doesn't have that clarity, doesn't have a futuristic scope. It's more of a headlines kind of a deal than a very comprehensive clarity based deal.
Right. No, I think I agree with you on that last point. And we're all hoping that it gets to a better sort of some concrete form going ahead, right? But so as you mentioned, right, given this uncertainty with the Trump administration, the uncertainty in the overall geoeconomic environment, there's a high possibility of Trump backtracking on the agreed commitments here, right? And this announcement as well, we've discussed that it one of the factors of this announcement coming about was the India EU deal. So what do you think are the things that we can expect going ahead, and what are some of the things that India could again negotiate better, and the overall trade strategy that India could adopt in such uncertain times?
Yeah. So, like I said, I just want to reiterate the good part of the deal is that it provides us kind of a small, fragile window of opportunity for us to rethink our trade strategy. And also, like, the negotiations part is good because that means, like, India also can take a introspective look at its own policies and see, like, policies actually make our exports competitive, efficient, and what is actually redundant and like doing the exact opposite of what it was supposed to do, right? So all those things, like negotiations in that sense is really good, and that's where we are right now. So in that sense it's good. But the worst part of this deal, of this interim deal, is that it does not offer Indian exporters any protection against the unpredictable nature of the Trump administration. Like you said, he can go back on his word as well. So that unpredictability, and with Trump nobody knows anything, stands true as of today. So, like the example that we discussed of the US EU deal earlier. So, like these conditions exist, right? So, that's why, like, India has to look at this as more of a narrow deal. Even if we sign a comprehensive deal with the US, you have to think of it, if it's under Trump administration, you have to think of it a slightly different than the other deals that we have with UK, with EU, with Australia, and all those things, right? So it's a narrow deal, and it could be reversed. It's more of a strategic window of negotiations, a strategic window of opportunity for us to diversify, for us to look into our own domestic policies and everything. So therefore, India, I think we should look this deal as a pathway to stabilize the trade flows rather than a comprehensive, trust based, long horizon agreement that
Right.
insulated from any future reversals or anything. So you have to look at it as a pathway as of now. And like again, like while we say that there is 0% tariff from all UX exports and all those things, I think, for example, like let's look at like some of the few concessions that India made, probably in few of the nuts and even in the agriculture sector. So it's not a comprehensive liberalization of the agriculture sector either, right? So it's more of like, we're focusing couple of things that gives the headlines, that gives that, leeway for us to negotiate and everything. So let's look at it from that pure perspective itself and see, like, what would be the impact. Let's focus on those couple of sectors and see, like, what would be the impact if you open up. And it's, if it's disastrous, again, like, like we have to treat Trump's word, we also have to see, like, if we might have to go back on our word, we can. So let's look at it. But it might be good for India to open up some of the sectors too. I think one is that even if we take some of the US soy exports to kind of like, soften the US issues and everything. Even if you take the soy thing, like, we can use it for livestock feed preparations and everything. And soybean oil is already imported a lot in India. So we can look into those aspects and everything. So I think it might not be that bad in that sense. But again, you have to look at what are the sectors, what would be the impact. I think this is something that we have to study further. And I think even in this scenario, even if India has a proper comprehensive deal with the US, I think India needs to diversify its export markets, sign as many free trade agreement, which are like, complementary in nature with various trade partners that India has. And at the same time, we also have to look at some of our domestic environment for like exports, for competitiveness, like how our sector is doing, like where we need to push and all those things. So I think that window of opportunity is like, right here, and we have to do that. So overall, like trade is increasingly shaped by domestic political incentives at this moment, right? And strategic considerations also is being playing a big role in the trade strategy of India and every other country. So right now we don't have a multilateral rules or long-term commitments. It's transactional, and I think India should move with that change of wave as well. And so that's why, like, it also requires India to, like, revamp its trade strategy in a way that it's resilient to the uncertainty rather than optimized for a single assumed outcome. So here we have to be like, look at our national interest and see like what would be the best strategy for India and go ahead with that.
Right.
And yeah, I think trade agreement with the United States, of course, would immediate, like, ease some of the pressures that we have been facing on exporters and reduce some bit of uncertainty. But I don't think it should not be interpreted as like a long term solution, but more of an immediate solution. And this agreement is again limited in scope, and it's shaped by US domestic politics and subject to reversal. So we have to treat it as it is. but look at what are the other ways that we can enhance our exports and competitiveness in the global market.
Right, Anishree. So I think treating this deal as an opportunity for India to improve its own policies and export competitiveness sums it up quite right. So yes, thank you. Thank you for all of those insights and for sharing with us all the details from the deal. And I hope our listeners enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for more. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.